The Lasombra are not known for their egalitarian or humanitarian outlook. Raised Darwinist, most keepers will gladly shed what remains of their humanity for the sake of power and dominion over others. And any newly embraced who have second thoughts about this lifestyle are often dealt with harshly if they even survive the first period of undeath. The anti-tribu, unlike what you would believe, do not stray from this mindset, but embrace it, for among those who chose to follow Montano instead of Gratiano, arrogance, superiority, and the will to dominate runs strong, perhaps even more so than the rest of the clan. Few are those Lasombra who would have the fortitude to cling to their humanity, and even fewer are those who would. Theirs is an existence fraught with hardship and suffering, mockery and ridicule by those with whom they share blood. Eleanor Abate was born in 1915 on a small farmland in the state of New York. Having a good head, not to mention a chip the size of a small boulder on her shoulders, Eleanor was accepted to study law at college in the early 30s. There, despite discrimination for her sex and humble background, she earned herself a bachelor's degree in business, and then carried on to perform the 3 years of instruction required before she was allowed to take the bar exam. She passed it in 1940, but had little time to put it to use as the United States joined the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor. She enlisted, joining the Navy Reserves, and hoped to do her part in the war. Eleanor hated the time in the reserves, her expectation quickly souring as she was forced to remain far from the conflict and made to idle away, potential wasted for no reason at all. When finally she did get positioned on the front line, it was in 1944 in Hawaii, relatively far from the active fighting. It was during her stationing there that she met Abraham Wallace, her future sire. Abraham had departed Europe hastily mere months earlier, and was now trying to keep as far away from there as possible. His plans to embrace a Nazi colonel had failed, and he was now avoiding the humiliation of rejoining the Cainites who knew about it until the memory would fade. Luckily for Abraham, another potential child quickly caught his interest. Eleanor had been arguing with her superiors when he spotted her, a heated dispute that had her walking away with an expression that Abraham knew only too well. For a while after he stalked her, learning more about this headstrong woman, and finally, almost a year later, he decided to embrace her. Eleanor went missing in action in 1945, just as she was about to return home. Abraham had been manipulating her for quite some time before that, an unknown benefactor who saw how she chafed under the chain of command, and who promised the power to take charge of her life. Eleanor was eager to climb further and accepted Abraham's promises on good faith. Yet when he embraced her, he found soon that as she discovered the darker aspects of vampirism, especially those of the Sabbat, she proved resistant to his teachings. She found the act of feeding from the unwary distasteful, and the Lasombra mindset clashing with her own worldview and values. She had a strong moral compass, and it was challenging for Abraham to erode it without resorting to extreme measures. He would dominate her into compliance, and if that did not work, he would verbally and physically abuse her, degrading and humiliating her in front of her equals until she did what he told her to. Thankfully for Abraham, his child also had a strong desire for earning praise from her superiors. Her packmates were all she now knew, and she saw how another Cainite, W.A.V.E.S, a gangrel anti-tribu, always seemed to do everything right and receive the most praise, inspiring her to strive for similar treatment from her own sire. Abraham realized his child's hunger for approval and exploited it. He himself feared that Otis might one day replace him in the pack, and thus he arranged for Eleanor and the gangrel to be alone, his sire being out of town. Her instructions were simple: diablerize him. Despite her reluctance, Eleanor did what she was told, and when it was done, the older Lasombra covered it up, relishing in the destruction of a potential rival and the obvious emotional suffering it caused this unruly child. Yet despite this crushing blow to her humanity, Abraham was not satisfied. In 1955, he had finally grown tired of her, and he decided to push her creation rite, the Sabbat rite of passage, early in the hopes that she would not survive the ordeal. Eleanor was told to remain on the ocean floor for 24 hours, and once the time was over, she was to find a mirror in a nearby shipwreck. Despite Abraham's certainty that she would fail, either dying in the process or be deemed a failure and giving him the rights to kill her, she pulled through, and she was reluctantly dragged through the Voldery before being left to herself. Abraham tolerated her presence after this, but only barely, and his ill treatment of her further drove home the point that, in his eyes, she was still a failure. This broke the already damaged woman to the point where there was almost nothing left in her. No enthusiasm, no joy in her service to the Sabbat and to her sire. But in the 1970s, Eleanor was taken to Montreal with her increasingly distant and uncaring sire. He had until that point only given her just enough attention so as to not be called lacking, and he hadn't bothered overseeing her tutoring. Yet despite his absence, Eleanor had grown and developed quite significantly in the field of obtenebration, and earning herself a deeper understanding of the abyss, not to mention her own faith and beliefs. Montreal, at the time the heart of the northern Sabbat movement, proved to be a wellspring of learning for the young Lasombra, and Abraham once more decided to pick up his training of her, taking a more active part in it as he realized she might otherwise succumb to her emotions to the extent that she could either embarrass him or bring unwanted attention upon their pack. Eleanor learned from other Sabbat in the city academically, all the while she was taught more fully how to defend herself by her sire. She was an apt knife fighter from her time in the Navy, but Abraham sharpened her to a knife's edge. Many were the times when she nearly died during their sparring, but in return her skills grew by leaps and bounds. Eventually her sire considered Eleanor ready, and he decided to part ways with his child. He sent her to New York, where she was to open a law firm in his name, securing finances for the pack and, in his own words, learn to profit from the suffering of others. Because of her inability to commit to the darker parts of the Sabbat, it was better if she remained distant from the more monsters of her sect. She became a Queen of Shadows, a disparaging name for those Lasombra who lacked the proper attitude to fully commit to the ideals of the Sabbat. So, in 1976, Eleanor Abate opened the W.A.V.E.S law firm in New York, working tirelessly to grow and expand it in a world that had changed significantly since she first got her degree. Even so, the years had not dulled her skills, and soon enough she had achieved such a level of success that she was able to expand the business she was now a managing partner of. And as the years passed, the hold Abraham had on his child had weakened, and as she had been given time to heal, far from both him and the pack she had belonged to, the Lasombra decided to move as far away as she could. Los Angeles was the city she chose to open her new law firm in, arguing that the anarch-free states, despite its tumultuous nature and unreliable vampire population, would be the perfect city to hide herself in. Posing as a Ventru, Eleanor was quick to align herself with the Camarilla, if only because of the protection it would earn her. Anti-tribu indeed, if not name. At the time of her arrival, the relationship between them and the Anarchs was, as is often the case, frosty, but due to the politicking of leaders on both sides of the aisle, there was a relatively stable ceasefire, and the city was divided thusly. Eleanor was an unknown, of course, so she needed to undergo her agoge and jump through all the loops and undergo all the rituals that were required of her without complaint. Fortunately for Eleanor, she was both experienced among vampires, albeit not of this sect, not to mention a quick learner, and while her acceptance amongst the city's blue bloods took time, it was certainly worth the wait for her. In fact, if she could completely hide amongst the pillars of the Camarilla in the city, she could perhaps also move on from the troubled past that had been plaguing her life for so long. Yet fate had other plans in store for her. Abraham would find her once more, demanding that she reinforce her loyalty to him and the Sabbat. Not desiring to return, and even worse, be exposed as a Lasombra, Eleanor faced a difficult choice. Ultimately, she fell upon her sire, draining him dry and consuming even his heart's blood. As the Lasombra's corpse withered away in her arms, she could hear his familiar chuckle in the back of her head. Perhaps it was the stress of the situation, or perhaps his soul had somehow survived when it should have been destroyed. But Abraham remained behind as a permanent stain of ink, seeping in and blackening all that it touched. Eleanor's fate remains unsure, but as time goes on, she may yet find some form of peace in her nightly existence. Like many others of her clan, she has created ghouls to aid her, although she finds the process troubling. While Albert, her driver, has remained with her for a longer time, their relationship is much more professional than that which she shares with the younger woman Allie, whom she's inducted into her secret world only a few months ago. Allie, despite their difference in age and experience, often served to remind Eleanor of the humanity she struggles to retain, and of the innocence that she once exhibited before Abraham took it away from her. Eleanor cares deeply, perhaps too deeply, of those around her, which might eventually blind the Lasombra to the threads of fate that connects her with those whom she meets. But should it come to it, she has learned, through pain if nothing else, the proper way to sever a cord. This video was made possible thanks to my patron StoneWolf18, whose support and friendship I value greatly. Thank you so much, and I hope I did Eleanor justice.